Hello, and welcome to this Foster Care Institute online training webinar. Trauma-Informed Parenting, Part 1. Understanding what trauma-informed means. This is a two-part webinar. The first part of this webinar, during this webinar here, we will understand what trauma-informed parenting means and look at. Part 2 will examine strategies and solutions to care for children who are suffering from trauma in a trauma-informed fashion. I'm your host, the founder and director of the Foster Care Institute, Dr. John DeGarmo. I'm also an author, a speaker, a trainer, and a foster and adoptive parent myself. Indeed, I've had over 60 children come to live in my home as a foster parent. I have seen a great deal of trauma and anxiety in my home with the children that have come to be part of my family. So I'm quite aware of the experiences that foster parents have when they're caring for children with trauma, caring for children with anxieties. So how do we become trauma informed? Well, during this first webinar in this two-part series, our goal is to increase the awareness of what trauma-informed parenting is for those who care for children in foster care. Indeed, we will increase our awareness of trauma and anxiety and how it impacts lives. So we hear a lot about trauma-informed parenting. What is it? What is trauma-informed parenting? Well, a trauma-informed parent is one that, first of all, has an understanding of what trauma is and appreciates the fact that every event that happens to a child does not have to be disastrous, so to speak, for it to be traumatic to a child or to you and I, to other individuals. Indeed, trauma-informed parenting are parents that recognize the symptoms of trauma can be triggered well after a stressful experience has occurred for that individual. For some people, this may cause lasting effects, both emotionally and physically, as well as psychologically. A trauma-informed parent is one that understands that each child that comes to live in our home experiences trauma differently. They experience it different than other children because each child is unique. Each child is unique, therefore the experience they have to the trauma is unique to them as well. For you see, what might be a traumatic experience for one child simply may not be for another child. Each child will respond differently. Each child will respond to that traumatic experience in their own unique way. A trauma-informed parent is one that understands that it might take some time for a traumatic experience to even be recognized by you or by a therapist or even revealed by the child. Indeed, it might take several months or even years for that trauma that is inside that child to appear on the surface, to appear in front of you. A trauma-informed parent is one that appreciates that post-traumatic stress can affect other matters of the child, including their social behavior, their performance in school, their emotional outbursts, and even isolation. A trauma-informed parent is one that is equipped to help the child to better manage their issues that are related to trauma and post-traumatic stress. Finally, a trauma-informed parent is one that is equipped to help the child's doctor in diagnosing what the trauma might be and how to best address it. Now, in so many areas in foster care, there are myths and misconceptions about what trauma is. There is the myth, you may well know, and we've seen this in other training webinars here, at the Foster Care Institute, there is a myth that children are happy to be placed in a foster care home. Indeed, you may have heard this yourself. Oh, they must feel so lucky, so fortunate, so happy to be placed in your home, to be living with your family. And that, as we know, is a myth. We also understand that there's a myth that love can fix and heal all things. Love cannot fix all things. There is a myth that children in foster care should immediately love their foster parents and should be grateful and happy for rescuing them. This is a myth. There is a myth that if the child doesn't talk about the issue that is causing them great anxiety, that problem, that trauma, that anxiety will simply go away. This is a myth. And finally, there is that myth that children in foster care should not feel any love, any emotional attachment, anything towards their abusive parents and their abusive family. No sense of loyalty, no sense of love, no sense of attachment. That is a myth. As we've seen here at the Foster Care Institute, on any given day in the United States of America, approximately, there are 500,000 children in foster care. This number indeed fluctuates month to month, week to week, and day to day. But that is a rough estimate. According to a study in 2011, approximately 48% of children or youth in foster care have emotional or behavioral problems, and 63% are victims of neglect. Now, if you have been a foster parent, a caseworker, a CASA, or an advocate for children in foster care, then you know that this is false. Indeed, I would ask you for just a moment, ask yourself this: what is the true percentage of children or youth in foster care that have emotional behavioral problems? Go ahead and ask yourself that. Perhaps you might agree with me when I suggest to you that that number is not 48%, but that number is closer to, yes, probably closer to 100%, because it is a traumatic experience for a child to be placed in a foster care home. Children in foster care experience a great many feelings. They're taken from their home. They're taken from their family. They're taken from their school. They're taken from everything that is familiar to them, many times without any explanation, many times late at night. This is traumatic for the child. For so many children, I should say, for so many of these children, many times it is a time of great uncertainty. They simply are unsure of what is happening to them. Why are they being removed from their home? Why are they being taken away from their mommies and their daddies, and even sometimes their siblings? Why are they being placed into a strange home with strange people? This is a traumatic experience. For some of these children, they experience guilt when they're removed from one home and placed into a foster care home. They may believe that it is their fault. They may believe they did something wrong. They may believe that the reason their parents are in trouble, so to speak, is because of something they may have done. This guilt is traumatic and causes anxiety within the child. And for so many of these children, they don't have the words, nor the understanding or the comprehension to express how they are feeling. They simply have an inability to express themselves. It is a time of confusion for so many of these children. They simply do not understand why they've been placed into another home. They do not understand why they've been placed into your home, the foster care home. Some children may see it as an irrational or illogical move. Some may blame themselves. Some children may feel they're no longer loved. Their mommies and their daddies no longer love them. Other children may feel abandoned. According to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, they define trauma as this: widespread harmful and costly public health program. It occurs as a result of violence, abuse, neglect, loss, disaster, war, and other emotionally harmful experiences. Trauma has no boundaries with regard to age, gender, socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, geography, or sexual orientation. This is what trauma is defined as by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. The National Children's Traumatic Stress Network defines traumatic stress as this: the physical and emotional responses of a child to events that threaten the life or physical integrity of the child or someone critically important to the child. Again, this is the definition of traumatic stress by the National Children's Traumatic Stress Network. For some of you, you've heard of complex trauma. Complex trauma occurs when the trauma continues through the repetition of similar events or an accumulation of separate ones. As the experience continues to happen over and over and over, the same type of trauma, the same type of abuse, if you will, continues to repeat itself over and over and over, or when separate different experiences happen that are traumatic, when they begin to accumulate, this is complex trauma. Complex trauma happens over a period of time. Indeed, these traumatic events reinforce learning about trauma in the child. There are 3 E's of trauma. The first is this: the event. The traumatic events include forms of abuse, domestic or community violence, accident, natural disaster, or war. Indeed, a report came out recently that stated that over 5 million children in the United States witness or experience domestic abuse, domestic violence within their own homes. Experience. Now, the traumatic experience is difficult to measure as it relates to how someone reacted to that specific event. This traumatic experience, this event, may differ from one person to another person, between cultures or genders, and even age groups. Finally, the third E of trauma is the effect. The reactions a person has to a traumatic experience. This experience can change or alter a person's well-being and indeed their behavior, both right now and their behavior in the future as well. And this type of effect can have a long-term impact on the development of the child. The development of the child in regards to learning, the development of the child in regards to their social abilities, their behavior. If you've been a foster parent or worked with children in foster care for some time, you know this to be true. So why do we have trauma-informed parenting? Well, trauma invades every single part of a child's or anybody's life if they've experienced that trauma, and this is pervasive. Trauma can indeed be lifelong. And we see this what happens when it happens when a child ages out, or youth ages out of the foster care system. We've seen that in the statistics where 55% do drop out of school, and 65% do end up homeless, and 75% do end up incarcerated. And for so many of these youth, this system, this cycle repeats itself again for their own children, the next generation, because this trauma is lifelong. Trauma shapes lives and runs so deep inside the person who has been affected by that trauma. And as we saw earlier, trauma is diverse and unique for every single person. Each child in your home that is placed in your home will react to a traumatic experience in their own separate and unique way. Why trauma-informed parenting? Well, trauma can be self-perpetuating and become cyclical. As I mentioned, it may be passed down to the next generation. If you've read some of my books or heard me speak, then you recognize and understand and appreciate that two of the children that I've adopted from foster care are third generation foster care, which means it's a cycle. It has repeated itself. Trauma affects relationships of all kinds. Relationships between one child and another child, between siblings, between birth parents, between you and the child in foster care, the foster parent and the child in foster care, between caseworkers and the children, between the therapists, their teachers, everybody. And indeed, trauma often affects the more vulnerable. Those who are most vulnerable, trauma often affects them the most. Trauma affects brain development. You see, at birth, the brain is not completely structural. And when a traumatic experience happens at that age, it's so critical for that child's brain development. And if a traumatic experience happens, it can affect the brain development. The infant's brain adapts to what it feels, to what it hears, and what it sees. And if it's enveloped, or it's surrounded, or it's experiencing traumatic experiences, it affects their brain. Their brain adapts to it. Their brain adapts to everything that's around them. Trauma inhibits development of both the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex in the brain. Now, this hinders development of working memory, of control, and cognitive flexibility. Children cannot be expected to provide their own high-quality stimulation. This stimulation requires interaction with other people. You, the caseworkers, siblings, grandparents, teachers, anybody that child encounters is a so-called teacher for that child. As that child's brain begins to develop, everybody they meet and interact with and talks to them is some sort of teacher who is imprinting a lesson on that child's brain. When learning occurs under extreme stress, this indeed produces modifications that cause structural changes in the brain development. Let me read that again to you because this is important. When there is learning occurring under extreme stress, this produces modifications that causes structural changes in brain development. The more emotionally charged the learning environment is, where that child is, the more emotionally charged that environment is. When they're in that home and there's all that abuse, neglect happening, this is more likely going to result in long-term changes or modifications in the child's brain development. A child must establish trust during their infant years. When any type of profound loss occurs during this time, a sense of trust with adults and others may be lost. There is a reason why an infant and a child has a difficult time trusting you as a foster parent, trusting you as a caseworker or a CASA, because they never established trust to begin with. Now they may display this through apathy, loud continuous crying, mournful crying, withdrawal, Let's look what trauma does to the preschool ages, 2 to 5 years of age. Now, during this time, if you've had those children in your home at this age, you know there is no logical thinking with this age group. Children do not understand cause and effect. A sense of permanence is not appreciated either. Preschoolers may have experienced feelings of denial, guilt, hopelessness, or profound sadness if they have experienced traumatic experiences in their life. Once a loss is experienced at this age, what I mean by loss, I mean when they're removed from their home and placed into your home, a foster care home. This is a loss of their family. And once they've experienced that, once they've been removed from their home during this age group, they may experience additional fear. Experience fear of losing you or somebody else. See, they become afraid of losing you or their caseworker or somebody else in their life, and they may become anxious or clingy or even stubborn. For those children 6 to 11 years of age who have experienced a traumatic experience, they begin to appreciate cause and effect during this age group. They begin to form logical thinking process, although it is certainly not developed all the way yet. The understanding of consequences begin to form. They begin to appreciate that, oh, there is cause and effect. There is a consequence to every action. Those children who have experienced some type of trauma in their life may become preoccupied with the loss of you or a caseworker or somebody else in their life, or have other worries. As they grieve the traumatic loss of their parents or their siblings or their biological family members, or maybe even other foster parents in their life, their school is sure to suffer. Indeed, we go through this in several webinars here at the Foster Care Institute about the many experiences, many challenging experiences that children have in foster care while placed in school. Child may lash out in behavior problems or withdraw from others socially in school as well. Their schoolwork and grades may simply seem unimportant. Their learning suffers. They fall behind in reading and math skills. Indeed, children in foster care are generally, on average, 18 months behind traditional students in both reading and math skills. School is the last place a child in foster care who has experienced some type of trauma wants to be. And we go into this in great detail in the book Helping Foster Children in School. Those children who are adolescents, 12 to 18 years of age, who have experienced some type of traumatic loss in their life, they begin to grieve like an adult. And they go through the stages of grief. Those stages of grief by Kubler-Ross. The stages of grief introduced by Kubler-Ross in 1969. I would encourage you to watch the online training webinar at the Foster Care Institute on that very topic. Those children who are suffering from trauma, while placed in your home or under your care or supervision, hey, they're simply doing the very, very best they can. Now, what makes up a traumatic experience? Remember, one of the things that we need to do to become trauma informed is to understand what places a child into this category. Well, prolonged separation between their birth parents or siblings and themselves, the death of a family member, is a traumatic experience, various forms of abuse, or witness of abuse to others. They may witness their birth mother being beaten and abused by their birth father, or something in regards to that way. They may experience homelessness. In fact, that is a very traumatic experience for a child. Drugs and alcohol in the family, neglect, abandonment, the imprisonment of family members. These are all traumatic experiences. And as a trauma-informed parent, you need to understand and appreciate this. When a child is placed into your home, a placement disruption, when they're removed from their family and placed into a foster care environment, this is a placement disruption, and this has emotional, social, and psychological effects on the child. Indeed, their mental health is threatened each time they are moved. When they are moved from their home to a foster care home, to another foster care home, and yet another foster care home, this is multiple disruptions, and their mental health is threatened by this. And as we've seen in other webinars here, academic performance is lower than traditional students due to this placement disruption. So as a trauma-informed parenting, we need to know what these symptoms look like. What does trauma look like in a child? They have a difficult time concentrating. Children who have experienced trauma may have a difficult time sleeping. They may become angry or have some sort of rage. They may experience paranoia. They may have behavior issues or seem to act out, so to speak. Those children who experience trauma in their life, they may have regression, they may bedwet, they may cling to yourself, and they may threaten themselves with suicide. Indeed, suicide is the third largest cause of death for teenagers in America today. Now, I must note this. If a child who's placed in your home ever threatens themselves, threatens harm to themselves in some way, you must report it immediately. You must document it immediately. You may think it's an empty threat. You may think it's just a child's way of getting attention, seeking attention. Nevertheless, whatever it might be, if they ever verbally imply they're going to threaten themselves, commit suicide, or self-harm, you have to document it and report it to the caseworker ASAP. We have a training webinar here about documentation at the Foster Care Institute, and I would encourage you to watch that webinar so you can know how to properly document this and report this. Other symptoms, other things to look at when a child has suffered from some sort of trauma. They may be eating quickly or food hoarding. They may have a loss of appetite. Indeed, we have a Foster Care Institute training webinar all about that. Their academics and school behavior will suffer. They may claim to be sick often, or they may have no sense of future in their life. Finally, they may have psychological disorders, they may have substance abuse problems, physical illness, attachment problems, again, suicidal thoughts. These are all things to look for in a child who is suffering from some sort of trauma. A trauma-informed parent is one who recognizes that post-traumatic stress disorder is very, very real in children in foster care. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or we often call it PTSD, is an anxiety disorder occurring after someone has experienced or witnessed an extreme traumatic event. The individual feels overwhelming fear, they feel overwhelming terror, or they just simply feel helpless. We hear a lot about PTSD with our U.S. war veterans, and indeed we should, because they're certainly suffering from that. But did you know this? Did you know this? That children in foster care are twice as likely to suffer from PTSD than our U.S. war veterans. 21% of children in foster care, of youth in foster care, of alumni who have aged out of foster care, who have left the foster care system, still suffer from PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder is emotionally numbing. Those who suffer from it are emotionally non-responsive many times. They may experience flashbacks or continue to re-experience the traumatic event. They may become hyper-aroused in that they're irritable. They seem to be on guard all the time. They may seem disorganized. They may have disturbing memories or recurring dreams. They may have strong psychological distress over an incident that appears similar to their own experience. For example, you may have a child placed in your home who suddenly, without any sign of warning, seems to have a strong psychological distress over something that happened in your home. You might not know what triggered it, but it may be something similar to an experience they had that caused the original trauma. And then there are those anniversaries event. Maybe an anniversary of an event of the day the parents perhaps died, or the anniversary of an event where a child was removed and placed into a foster care home, or the anniversary of the event where the parents were incarcerated, or the initial abuse began. That often re-triggers the trauma. Those who suffer from PTSD often try to avoid the thoughts and feelings associated with the original traumatic event. They seem to often avoid activities or people or places that bring back memories of the initial traumatic event. They may have a loss of interest in other activities. They may seem detached from your family, from others. They may have a lack of loving feelings towards anybody, and any sense of future for them seems to be obsolete. Separation anxiety is a form of trauma. The more a child is moved from one home to another, from one school to another, the more they move, the more the anxiety will increase. You see, separation from family and friends creates anxiety within the child, within anybody. And for that child who's moved from one home to another home and to another home, the anxiety increases. Those children who undergo multiple displacements makes it very, very challenging for that child to form any sense of relationship, any sense of attachment, any sense of trust, because they simply do not know when they're going to be moved again. They don't know if they can trust you as a foster parent or as a caseworker because they may be moving again soon. So many times these children will place emotional walls or barriers to separate themselves from the pain, to separate themselves from you. Disinhibited social engagement disorder, DSED, is an attachment disorder where the child will actively approach unfamiliar people, strangers, in an attempt to interact with them. I have a child who has this. They'll walk up to any stranger and begin a conversation with them. This may develop due to the lack of nurturing or affection they should have initially received from the caregiver in their initial years. They sadly never got it. We go into this in great length in the book, The Foster Care Survival Guide. I would encourage you to pick up a copy as it has a whole chapter about trauma and the different forms of trauma. But let's continue with DSED. Those children who suffer from disinhibited social engagement disorder often seek out affection and loving relationships with other people, with those strangers. They bond with others. This is a child who will run up to any stranger and give them a hug and give them a kiss because they feel completely comfortable with strangers. As comfortable with a stranger as they did with somebody who they've been living with for a very long time. They're very talkative and very social with these strangers, and they have no apprehension or fear of giving a stranger a kiss or a hug. And you can understand why this can lead to a very dangerous lifestyle. Reactive attachment disorder, also known as RAD, is an attachment disorder similar to DSED, where the child is unable to form any sense of healthy relationship or attachment with the initial parent or the caregiver. It may result, though, from abuse or neglect early in the child's life. Children who suffer from RAD often have a lack of affection towards you or towards anybody. They have a lack of response when you show affection to them. They have a difficult time looking you or anybody in the eye. And they have a difficult time interacting, talking, communicating, socializing with other people. When angered or frustrated, a child with a reactive attachment disorder is often so difficult, so challenging to calm them down because they simply feel they have lack of control. Many times these children with RAD are withdrawn, they're sad, and they are so many times distrustful of everybody. Other forms of trauma and disorder include depression, adjustment disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, acute stress disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, and eating disorders. These all occur due to trauma in a child's life. Now remember, As someone who is now parent informed, a trauma informed parent, we must remember this: how every single child reacts is going to be different. As a foster parent, you never can get used to the job because every child that comes into your home is going to respond in a different way due to their own personal experience to the trauma. These reactions may result in their age or their developmental stage. It may be affected by their relationships or if they are a victim or a witness to the abuse. Finally, there is past trauma and traumatic experiences that may cause their reaction. Post-trauma and challenges can differ in each child as well. Each child needs their own different sort of support. Each child will be helped differently from one child to another. As a trauma-informed parent, you have to find the support system for that child with other adults. We will examine all of this in part 2 of this 2-part webinar series. You know what? Being a foster parent is challenging. It is difficult. There are days when you might say, I can't do this anymore. And that is normal because you're caring for children who have suffered anxiety, who have suffered trauma, and they're bringing that anxiety, they're bringing that trauma into your home. And it doesn't matter how trauma informed you are as a foster parent or as a caseworker or as a parent in general, there are those days where you need a little bit of inspiration. You need a little bit of motivation. This is the book for you. The Little Book of Foster Care Wisdom. 365 days of inspiration and encouragement for today's foster care families. And we have many other books available at the Foster Care Institute. Hey, check out part 2 of this 2-part webinar series on trauma-informed parenting and all the online training webinars at the Foster Care Institute and so much more at Dr. John DeGarmo, fostercare.com. Follow me on Facebook and Twitter. And if you have any questions about this or other topics, please email me at drjohndegarmo@gmail.com. Being a foster parent is hard. It is challenging. And sometimes we simply don't feel that we're doing what the child needs. We're giving them what the child needs. There are those moments where we think to ourselves, are we doing a good job? Is what we're doing actually matter for this child? Are we making any sort of impact in that child who has suffered from so much trauma, so much anxiety? Is there anything we can do that can really help this child? I want you to know this. What you're doing does matter. What you're doing is important. What you're doing does make a difference. So for all of us here at the Foster Care Institute, I want to say thank you. Thank you for being a foster parent, a caseworker, a CASA. Thank you for being an advocate for children in need. And thank you for taking part of this webinar.